Welcome to Porch Play Chats, sponsored by the American Association for Promoting the Child's Right to Play, or more affectionately called IPA-USA. IPA-USA is the USA affiliate of the International Play Association. You can find more about IPA World by visiting ipaworld.org. You can also find more about us at IPAUSA.org. Porch Play Chats are our effort to promote play. And they're just wonderful conversations with people who are just as passionate about play as we are. You can find all of the Porch Play Chats that are free to you on the IPA.org website. Up in that top right-hand corner is the link to our YouTube channel and to our Facebook page. Subscribe to YouTube channel, be a friend on our Facebook page, and magically, every Monday, a new Porch Play Chat appears in your feed. I'm Deb Lawrence, and I'm the president of IPA USA. With me on the porch is Lisa Murphy, one of our board members.
Hello, nice to be back.
And joining us today is Heather Bernt Santy. Heather, we can't wait because Heather is known as the early childhood nerd. Aren't you fascinated already? And has been working with children and their families and their caregivers for 30 years and has loved very nearly every minute of it. She's a believer in children's right to play and in the science that tells us that play is right. And that early childhood nerd offers consulting and webinars and hosts a podcast by the same name. So make sure you look up her podcast. So today, Heather's going to talk to us about schema play theory as advocacy. So Heather,
yes,
why do you think that schema play and that theory is a good tool for play advocacy?
Well, because I more and more, the more I think about how we can really turn things back to play for young children, I think families are key and they're overlooked. We worry about policymakers and we worry about regulatory agencies, and those also are in the, they're part of this picture. But I in the trenches, in the world so I teach college, my students here in the early childhood education program here, the people that I've worked with when I worked in childcare centers, the people that I talk through to, in comments who are listening to the podcast, overwhelmingly say that the reason they're afraid to move more playfully in their work with young children is because families want it when they talk about the academic and the sort of earlier is better, let's make it look like school kind of practices that I see and hear about so often. And I think that schema play theory, which I want to just for a minute make a distinction, because a lot of people, if they've never heard about this before, think, oh yeah, Piaget, I know about him. But what I'm talking about is a discovery essentially of Chris Athey in the late 70s, who was working in a program called the Froebel Early Education Project. And she identified these repetitive play patterns that we could pull from watching children, and again, they're repetitive, so we see them over and over again. So that's what we're talking about, is this sort of extension of Piaget's initial thoughts about schema, and moving on to those specific kinds of schema that Chris discovered. So
I'm going to interrupt you. Are you able to give a quick overview of some of the things that people who aren't familiar with the repetitive pattern, like what they are?
Yeah, absolutely. In the initial research, I think they found over 40 different kinds of schema but we tend to focus on, it varies from 8 to 12 kind of common schema. I group a couple together, so I have a list of 8. So one is transporting, where children are picking things up, moving them around, dumping things. Transforming, where they're just acting on materials to make a change and observe the change, or for themselves. Trajectory, figuring out how things move through space, including their bodies. And yes, the things in their environment. And then there's rotation and circularity, enclosing and enveloping, position and ordering, connecting, disconnecting, and then orientation and perspective. And so I have, if we need to get into it, I have a couple of examples of specific kids that I've observed that really exemplify a couple of those. But the idea is that in play, these are children who are just playing and exploring, the true free play, not guided play or whatever we want to call it. They started to see children being very repetitive with these patterns. And what I've learned as I've read it is that a lot of times what actually qualifies as a schema exploration gets lumped as misbehavior or just something that doesn't have any value. And so parents look at that and think, well, that's not a meaningful use of my child's time. That's not what I'm paying for in this program. And so teachers feel that pressure to continue to look like school. And so the more I look at it, the more I think these are such accessible ways of looking at children's play and looking at what's really happening in there, that if we could work with families to help see this, that they would start to go into those centers and programs and start saying, okay, but tell me about play instead of the phone call. Do you learn anything, or are you just a daycare there? Those kinds of things. Or how do you get them ready for school? We'd have families going in and say, talk about play. Tell me what play is like here.
Do you honestly think that we would know what to say if we actually started getting that question?
We'd have to learn, wouldn't we?
Yeah. No, it's not. Why do you do that activity? Because the children like it. No, that is not the answer. What's the answer?
Right. Yeah.
That's what I hear from my students. Oh, I planned it because children like it. No, that is not the answer. Give me the answer. And so I'm fascinated by this. And if you've got that article or that research, I would attach
for your
it
master's.
Yeah.
I did write a master's paper on this. So
perfect. I would attach it for, the viewers or the listeners so that they would have the research behind it, because I think that it's interesting in a podcast that we've done in this series. We had the president of IPA World on, and she was talking about, play is as necessary. Play is a requirement, not a recreation, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's as necessary and critical to development as food and water and shelter and safety. And she said, but if we could convince families that it was, so I think these two sort of marry together. In fact, I'm going to put them right. Either I'm going to figure out a way to do them in order. Yeah. Because the two of them really emphasize each other. And so I think that finding ways to engage families, because I'm a community college professor and then early childhood AA degree. And I find the same thing, only my students don't know how to play.
Yeah, there's that too. Yeah.
Yeah. So, unless they experience that.
Yeah. Well, and
I want to do it.
I think part of the problem is that if I'm talking again specifically about families as advocates for play, we expect someone working in an early childhood program to have some training, to have some expertise and some understanding of how children develop and learn. Families don't get that. They get marketed to. And from the before they're even ever pregnant, they are getting ads for educational toys, and everything has to have value. And you've got to get them started early so that we can compete with this mystery monster out there that we're not competing well enough with, that drives a lot of this. And these 8 schemas and the kinds of actions that we see them doing in the schema, and then the kind of learning that we can see attached to that are like, it's so easy for someone. They don't have to go to school and get a degree to be a parent who advocates for play for their child. They can have these 8 kind of things. And in fact, what I did in the master's thesis that I wrote is I did some research, and it was a very small sample size, but we did a pre-test about what their attitudes about play were and what they, so there were 4 or 5 questions around that idea. And then there was a list of the kinds of behaviors that that you might see when children are exploring a schema, like throwing things or sweeping things off a tabletop or knocking down a block tower or climbing under a table, those kinds of things that sometimes are seen as misbehavior, how likely they would be to stop those things. And that was their pretest. And then we did just a short hour presentation on schema play theory and brief introductions to how it impacts brain development, and did the post test, and their answers all changed to moving more towards being more accepted. They still weren't quite comfortable not stopping some of those behaviors, but their ideas about play and the things they commented about outside of the multiple choice research questions showed that just in that little bit of introduction to schema, they were thinking differently about things.
Do you, and this is probably overthinking, but that's my style. Do you think to some degree that there was an opportunity for them to see that, like as an adult, I might not have seen any inherent value in that particular thing, that activity, that repetitive motion. I had this brief intervention. I started to see that there is something here. Maybe I just wasn't familiar with it. Do you think that would have the potential to then get them to see for forever that just because my child is engaged in a behavior, whether it looks like some of these schema that you taught me about or not, that just because I'm not seeing the inherent value or benefit from it, that maybe I should just leave it alone? Like, do you think it has the potential to?
Yeah, I do. Because that plant or that seed has been planted, right? That they start to say, okay, the knocking down the block tower might mean something more than being destructive, and that fussing about where their food is placed on a plate is part of positioning and ordering schema, or the kid who always wants to be first in line, instead of seeing that as being selfish or rude or whatever, we see that as an experiment in position and ordering. Just thinking about that one thing a little differently, I think can have that effect of, well, maybe other things are different too. And even if I don't understand exactly what that difference is, I think just that change, that there's something maybe deeper going on and I should pause, I think can be so valuable.
Yeah, I think so too.
So I see a marketing value here. I've always wanted to do a book that says, do this, not this. And here's why. This is what we need, right? Yeah. Don't criticize them, recognize what they're doing. And in a positive, parent-friendly, it could be an app at this day and age. People don't buy books much anymore. So, but it would.
Could you imagine, like, how you can identify your plants? Like you can take a picture of the kids.
Schemas.
What schemas?
We could make millions. I mean, just think about that.
But I did have for a while parents of the children in the preschool I was teaching at. I started having conversations with a couple moms in particular, because I was seeing really distinct patterns with their two children, and they started to send me pictures of their children at play and say, or my coworker, like her toddler started leaving like the plastic pretend hot dog on the toilet seat all the time. Like he would close it and leave the hot dog there and wander off and then come back for it. And she said, he's been doing this for 2 weeks. Could this be a schema exploration? And we talked about, that could be transporting. It could be transforming the bathroom or, whatever. We talked about it, and it seems minor and silly, but I think there's power in that.
Well, and what do we know how the kid's not going to go back and keep repeating something? I mean, barring like stimming and some kind of, special needs or something neurological that might be an entirely different conversation. I just have found that assisting people in seeing that just because you wouldn't do it for 2 weeks doesn't mean that it's not worth doing, because I'm not a biologist but to me, it just kind of makes basic sense that you're not going to keep doing something if you're not getting some kind of return on that investment, whether you're 18 months old or 1 year old or 40 years old.
Yeah. And, I just lost my train of thought, but it was going to be good.
It's going to be great. It'll come back in. That's what happens to me. It just flies right back in. I say to my students, hold on, it'll be back in a minute. But I have a question. One of the things that I see, and I talk to my students about this, is that we project adult behavior onto children, right?
Yes.
So we see them as being disrespectful when we've told them to use their words and they're yelling at us, right? Oh no, that's disrespectful, don't do that. And so again, I think this recognition that these schemas have a purpose, and to look at it through that lens instead of seeing it as a inappropriate action. And a perfect example of that is when we do, we use the West Ed curriculum for infant and toddler courses, and the discoveries video with cause and effect, object permanence learning schemes. My students are like, oh, infant rooms are boring. And I'm like, boring?
Yeah.
And so then we talk about what's happening in an infant room, and then I show them the discoveries video, and then I say, so now go and observe in an infant room and come back and tell me what you see. And they're like, oh my God, I saw all sorts of development. I'm like,
yeah,
but they didn't know what to look for.
Exactly.
Right?
And I think
see it.
Yeah, Schema is an especially good tool for those who don't understand toddlers, who don't understand what's happening. If I can't sit them in a circle time, and if I can't do group activities, how can I possibly be supporting their learning? So Schema play theory applies to all the ages, but is specifically especially powerful for toddlers.
Yeah.
And that's a good, I'm glad you said that, because that reminds me of what I forgot to say, which is it connects for me to Emily Plank's book about the culture of childhood. And when you say we see things through our adult lens, that's sort of what we have to do. This is a whole different language. This is a whole different cultural practice that has value for those who are practicing it, that we have to put effort into seeing and understanding. And it takes a willingness on our side to do that.
When it takes us getting out of ourselves, right?
Yeah.
Instead of reflecting on how it's making you feel, we need to be seeing what is the child actually doing, right?
Yeah.
What is it? Not how it makes us feel. Yeah, our feelings are important, but sometimes they get in the way and they blind us to what the child is actually discovering or uncovering or being curious about. We get frustrated with it when we should be like, oh my God, look at what they just did.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a great learning for our listeners to help them take a step back and say, and I will put in Heather's Porch Play Chat, I'll put those 8 that she gave us and her master's thesis, if she doesn't mind sharing, so that you can delve more into this. What a wonderful staff development training.
Well, because you can't go aha if you don't even know what
aha is.
The aha. And there was actually a woman that I've been trying to get on the Porch Play Chat for a while, and she had shared during a conversation I was having with some California-based community college educators that one of the things that's and I don't want to put words in her mouth, especially if she's going to be a guest here. In a nutshell, what I wanted to talk with her about on the porch was her statement that one of her concerns is that she doesn't feel like her students have that and she like, how do you say that in words? Like, and how do you teach somebody that? And how do you learn if somebody does or doesn't have that? And can you teach somebody to have that? Look what the baby did.
Yeah.
You have no context as to why that's but
I can tell you, I've never done a workshop or a webinar on Schema, and I've done several in the last 4 years, where at least one person wasn't like, mind blown, this changes so much. And then if you can tell a story, like I find the slides are great, the conversation's great, the examples I show pictures of is great, but the stories that I'm able to tell about specific
tell us.
So, and you've probably heard some of these, Lisa, since we've recorded about this before on the Child Care Bar and Grill. But we had, so for example, I had a little boy, I'll say his name is Freddie because it is, and his mom won't mind. And he was 4, and he was very much following and enclosing and enveloping Schema throughout his whole, we were a morning program. So they were there for 3 hours, 4 days a week. And that we saw it repeated, like really repeatedly with him, but it was things like, he would build, those giant pillows, those giant cushions that you can get. He would build those into like a little cave that he could sit inside and be enclosed. And when he painted, he would start by on the easel, he would outline the whole outside of the paper and then paint across all the way. And one of the games he loved is for me to write his name on the easel paper, and he would paint over it. And then I would write his name again and he would paint over it until it just, that's part of that enclosing and enveloping exploration. We had one suitcase that he loved to just fill and carry things around in, which is transporting, but also enclosure, having all of those things. There was no rhyme or reason to what was in the suitcase. It was just, he wanted things in it and closed and locked. Whenever he played with Play-Doh, he would flatten the Play-Doh, put some kind of toy or prop inside, and then close the Play-Doh up around it. So we could just constantly see him closing things in. And
what a tool.
There's math and there's science, and it's all schema is sensory motor. It's your senses and your body moving. And we know that's how those neural pathways get strengthened. So it was all really amazing. What it looked like really random. Like we used to have a joke about where we'd find Freddie's suitcase full of the dramatic play, the contents of the drawer in dramatic play. But it was all either really useless and difficult to understand or really fascinating and exciting, depending on the starting point.
Yeah. Because again, as Lisa said, you don't know what you're seeing unless you know what you're seeing.
Right.
Unless you can filter it and apply it to what you understand about development and about these schemas.
Right.
So absolutely fascinating.
Yeah. So it's my mission to get schema play theory included in every community college early childhood.
Yeah, let's do it. Well, I think it would be perfect blend into child development courses and into methods and materials courses. I think it would be a perfect blend.
Yeah.
And I think without oversimplifying the concept, it's something that if you even did your own little bit of a deep dive into it, you could go back and inform your staff, perhaps a very 101 level, but that could be the shift between stop doing that with the Play-Doh, get over here, get the dress up things back into the center. Just knowing those 8 different things.
A simple documentation board of photos that you've gathered and captions could be really powerful.
Which leads to more yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
More
definitely.
yes. So I have another question so we've been talking, I think, about mostly typical children.
Yeah.
But I'm sure children who have disabilities have the same developmental schemas. They just might not be during the same time frame. So have you done any observations to see how those hold true with children with disabilities?
Well, the only 2 specific sort of labels that we put on children that I've looked at this through. I wanted to put lens in there somewhere, but it didn't fit in the sentence I was spitting out. Are sensory processing disorder and autism. But I want to go backwards for a minute and say that these aren't linear. They're not like stages children go through. It could happen at any moment. And you could have a child like Freddie who's really doing enclosing and enveloping all the time. Or you could have a child who does, today you see him really into transporting, and tomorrow she's really, you notice this other one is really into position and ordering, but you don't notice it all the time every day. So there's a couple different ways that you can look at.
That's an important reminder.
Yeah.
So, okay, transporting's done.
Right. You don't put it on your lesson plan and say from 9 to 9:30 we're doing transporting.
Oh, God, no. Well, and I think what would be rewarding for parents who are maybe concerned about their child's development is if they could see these patterns. What they don't have to be at a certain age or be synchronous or build on each other, but if they could see these patterns and understand what was happening and what development was taking place, that it doesn't really matter the disability or the age of the child, just like children who might have a disability that like Down syndrome or CP are going to go through the same sort of developmental processes, just at a different time to the best of their ability, right?
And if we're really looking at a play program, a play, whether you're a home or a center or a preschool, whatever you are, if we're really looking at being a place of play, those labels become less and less necessary.
Exactly.
Because we're not comparing children to each other. We don't have them on a fast track towards adult goals. We can see where they need support, and we can see how to provide that in the moment, instead of looking at this as, well, children with Down syndrome probably do schema differently. Well, every child probably does schema differently.
Right,
So
exactly.
it sort of unlocks us in that way too. And I guess the one sort of problem or barrier, I don't know, speed bump that I have had is when we talk about repetitive play patterns, that sets off red flags for conversations about autism. And it's not, kids who are lining up their cars all the time, they might just be figuring out position and ordering. If you don't see any other indicators that we have for a child who might be autistic, then we don't have to say, oh my God, he lines up his cars all the time.
Why is that the default go-to that people like instantly knee jerk? And I mean, I'm changing, I don't want to change the subject, but every single time that I have seen a child line up cars, the teacher whispers in my ear, I'm worried he might be autistic. And I'm like,
I don't know. It's easy.
Is that the only thing you've seen?
Right. It's the diagnosis du jour, right? It used to be ADD, ADHD.
Yeah, but I'm saying that one indicator, that one behavior seems to be like a
really, I don't know if it's just easy or if it's the one we see that most often. So we tack it to that word, and then we tack it to that workshop we went to, or that class we took about identifying developmental delays or whatever.
But yeah, Deb, I would agree that kind of, if you were going to say a diagnosis du jour, and then that brings up the big reminder that very few of our listeners are probably in any position to be saying that somebody needs to be diagnosed with something.
Yeah, but one of my other stories where we had one child who really was consistently showing us one schema over time was he only wanted to play with trucks, and mom was worried. And autism was discussed because that was all he ever wanted to do. And she wanted us to teach him how to play with other things, or to teach him she wanted us to take trucks out of the classroom. But when we looked at it through a lens of curiosity of whether this is a rotation and circulation schema that he was exploring, and we put roller paint brushes on the tabletop, and we put cars in the easel to paint with, and we put water wheels in the water table, and a wagon on the playground, and a doll buggy in the dramatic play. And we just put wheels everywhere. And then we did see him. Trucks were still his favorite, but we did see him kind of move around to try out other areas and other types of play. But that truck was always his favorite.
Did that reassure mom?
Yeah. That was part of the conversation that reassured her.
Right. And I think that, every parent in some cases, they're like, there's can't be anything wrong with my child. Or on the opposite end of the spectrum, is that something I should be worried about? Right. And so it's this reassurance that you can provide when you understand these schemas and these patterns. Yes. And it gives you the terminology to use with a family when you talk about the importance of child-initiated play for extended periods of time, so children can go through these schemas in whichever one they're interested in at the moment. But you can then talk about that in what Billy did today or Sarah did today, and parents understand what those schemas are, and then as you lift up what the child was really focused on that day, and you send that home, then the parents can lift that up at home, and it just makes that beautiful connection of, if they're not just playing. Right?
I really have seen it take pressure off of families who feel like this, so much of it looks like misbehavior. And then they have a new way of looking at what was so frustrating and what they felt like they just needed to focus on stopping before, instead of thinking about understanding it.
Heather, this has been amazing. This, really, I need to read that paper more, because it's been a while since I've thought about this. But this is truly an amazing way of looking at what children are doing in the classroom through a more informed approach, right? Because instead of seeing it as misbehavior or a mistaken behavior, we can give it another name that really is aligned with development. And
Yeah.
I think that is a gift for our listeners. So please listen and replay this many times. Any closing thoughts before we?
Well, I did want to make sure that I mentioned, and I didn't work it in before, that places like the United Kingdom and Australia, New Zealand have been implementing schema play theory for a while. And if you look for research, that's where you're going to find it coming from. It's very.
You mean we're late to the party?
Relatively new here in the States. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Really? The US was behind? Okay.
Sorry.
I
Sorry
know.
to break
No,
it. Yeah.
not a surprise. Not a surprise. So I'm going to close out. Don't go anywhere. I'll be right back. So to learn more about IPA-USA, please visit our website at IPAUSA.org. And until next time, keep on playing.
Bye-bye.
Bye.